Yo, what up everybody, it's DL Stewart, and today I am going to be showing y'all how to make a satellite rendered map, whether it's for a fantasy world or whatever. I have created an entire planet that's got, I can't even remember exactly how many lands on it, it's changed over the years. But there's a multitude of them, and I have created all the maps in Paint, and then also created them in Incarnate, which you'll see a little bit of that. And now I am going through and making a satellite rendered version of all the maps. I've only got 3 done, and the one I'm working on today for y'all will be number 4. So I'll be kind of going through the process of how to do that and, showing y'all my steps. I have already actually pre-recorded the computer version of it, and it took me over 7 hours worth of actually working on the map. So the video has been sped up. This video is not 7 hours. Don't freak out. So yeah, that's what we're getting to today. So let's just jump over to the actual map making process.
So first I start out by going to Google Maps. You go to satellite image, so you can get the satellite train. And you want to make sure your titles are off. That way all the street numbers and the town names and your little ping won't be showing up on the map. And then you can just kind of scroll around, try to find some transitions for the terrain, whether it goes from like trees to mountain range or whatever. Also try to mainly look for coastlines, similar to the type of terrain that I'm going to be looking for. So if it's desert, I try to go over to like Africa and stuff and try to find some desert coastlines. I try to do some forest and swamp like coastlines, and whenever I get to like mountains and stuff, I don't really want it to be solid white or anything like that, but if you want it, that is an option. But I usually like to try to get some that's got a little bit of green or whatever around it. And then after I take all of those screenshots of whatever images I want and save it to my computer, I usually open up in Paint or something and save it as a image or whatever on there, I go to GIMP and then I open up all the files onto the same document, as well as my map when I created it on Incarnate. So that's what you're kind of seeing right now is the Incarnate map, and a general idea of what I want it to look like. And it doesn't have to be exactly like this. This is kind of what I had planned on doing at that point. Right now I'm just kind of going through and erasing the water of that map and some of the grid lines and stuff. So I'm just kind of left with just that image. And then I go through all my screenshots and I start deleting all of the non-map portions of the video and then coloring to alpha white. That way it turns everything that's white within that selection to transparent, and that way everything will then be transparent once you delete it instead of having a white background. And then once you are left with just the images as a whole, I kind of erase a little bit of the water, just kind of enough for the coastline. And then I just generally start kind of placing them. I want this in this area, this in that area. And on the right side, you'll see in the layers, I'm kind of reorganizing them over there some. Just kind of keep track of it. And I reorganize those all the time while I'm actually working. But right now, my main focus on actual map creating is just moving the images close to where I want it. It doesn't have to be exactly where I want it. It doesn't have to be lined up or anything. It's just, moving it out of that center, and that way I can zoom in later and not have to go looking for the image, especially if it's in the middle and I'm on one far side or whatever. So I'm just kind of doing that. I might rotate it a little bit, as you can see on some of them, but mostly what I'm just doing is moving them around. As well as each time I move one, I duplicate the layer and move one copy of it and then hide the first one. That way, whenever I do make changes or whatever, resize or rotate or erase some, I still have the original image on there, so I don't have to reopen the image later. And then once I got everything kind of pretty close to where I want it, and then I start going through them layer by layer and actually kind of start placing it under the map and kind of tweaking it a little bit to get it more exactly where I want it. It doesn't have to line up perfectly, as you can tell with that image that I just laid on. I just kind of laid it there. I didn't really go in to make sure that the coastline or anything lined up perfectly. That's going to be something I'll do later. But right now, I'm just kind of getting it a little bit closer to where I want it compared to where I just loosely laid it, and as well as kind of erasing some of the extra that I know I'm not going to use, whether it be the water or some more of the land itself. But I'm kind of getting it more towards the general shape. This is kind of where I start actually building the shape of the land or whatever. It's just very rough. As you can tell, a lot of times I do just kind of duplicate the same one, especially with it's got similar terrain and a lot of different coastline shapes or whatever. And if I don't use all of the coastline on the image, I might duplicate it and use different portions of it kind of side by side. So like this one, it's more kind of curved up, like a little U shape on the coastline, and I don't want it like that, so I'm kind of tweaking it a little bit and almost making it more flat and jagged instead of, you know, that little bowl. So that's always an option as well. You don't have to use the coastline exactly how it is on the image. You can kind of tweak it and manipulate it how you want it to be. And also, I just want to point out that you do not have to make this part or be too concerned about this. At this stage, you don't have to have the terrain similar. If your terrain is completely opposite or whatever, you're kind of laying them on top of each other just because you wanted that coastline, that is perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about it.
Trapped inside my dome. This started small, but now it's grown. Hold up, don't go on a psycho. Let's go psycho. Let's go psycho. Let's go psycho. Let's go psycho. I'm on a back burner. Ha ha, fire. My blood is boiling. Feel like I'm hanging by a wire.
Right now, what I'm doing is going through and lining up the banks or the coastlines better. And what you can do a lot of times if it doesn't line up perfect is just kind of start erasing a little bit of the coastline on either image, and it will start to line up better. But you want that like little drop shadow almost to kind of line up. At times that drop shadow is more prominent than others. Other times it's more, you know, not. So just try to get it lined up as much as possible. And if you do have a spot where it is more prominent than others, like if it's really dark and thick, and then something else doesn't have any, maybe kind of taper down the image that has the thicker one so it looks like it doesn't have quite as much. So that's always a possibility. And then, like I just mentioned a while ago, at this point you're still not really focusing too much on trying to get the pictures to blend well or anything like that. You can have all these hard edges and such. It's not that big of an ordeal. It's just something you can, you know, kind of tweak on later on.
Sundays, but my kingdom we all wear masks, so no one can point the finger at us.
And I just want to say I think the hardest parts of creating a map and the most time consuming is the coastlines itself, which is why I actually start with the coastlines. I've seen some people, they will start just on one side of the map and get it completely done and slowly, build it across or up and down or whatever. For me, I find that the coastline is the hardest, so I try to get that done. And once you get that done, everything else is a breeze. As well as I'm not having to do as much, backtracking, because I've seen some of them where they would go across and then something wouldn't work out just how they wanted it, so they would have to like hit the undo button a lot just to kind of go back far enough so they can kind of start tweaking things and such. So I find that this process of laying everything out in the general area first, and kind of getting the majority of the coastline kind of placed out that way, and then going back and actually placing them kind of gives me a better idea. And then after I had done that, if I noticed I needed more images, I could stop and go to Google Maps again and look for some more images, and then I would know more about what shape or terrain that I would actually need. And then after all of that, then I would go back in and start lining up the coastlines and stuff at that point. And then usually after I get the coastline done, I don't have to usually go back and find any more images, because I can just still use whatever images I had used for the coastline for the inside, because I've got all that different terrain and stuff already. And usually what I do whenever I do try to do these, I try to get the coastline in there, but like the image that's showing now, I try to get a little bit of coastline, but a majority of the terrain. So I have a large image of terrain to use whenever I am trying to cover the center. So I usually try to find just like a couple images like that. I'm not too picky, or I am picky, but I don't try to go too far into it, trying to find so many different images of just regular terrain without coastlines as I am about the actual coastline itself. And also when I'm doing these maps, as you can probably have already tell with how the Incarnate map is, with all that white snow, which is supposed to represent the mountains or whatever. In this rendition, I've got more grass up there than mountains, even though I haven't really completed it or finalized it or anything. That's kind of where I started leaning towards. I am kind of like how I am with drafting my stories. I have an outline or whatever, I know what I kind of want, but as I'm working on it, I was like, oh, this looks better, so I'm not just set in my ways and it's just like it has to be like this or anything. I kind of change a little bit. For the most part, I know kind of the shape. I kind of change it a little bit to give it more of a natural look or whatever, with the coastlines and stuff. If it protrudes out a little bit more or has more of a cove somewhere or something like that, I'm open to those adaptations of it. There are some stuff that I do want a certain type of terrain in it. When I did METAGORE, each kingdom had its own terrain, so I knew for sure I wanted those terrains in those specific areas. But how they blended and the texture of those terrains, I was okay with altering them some, this and that. I knew there's some spots I wanted hills, and others I was like, I don't care if it's hills or not. I wanted Plainsland, but Plainslands have hills as well, so I was more open to those adaptations of it, even though I was more strict. It has to be fields and this and that or whatever, or it has to be deserts in certain areas. Well, as on this map for Direfell, I was just like, I want it to be mostly forest and some plainslands and stuff with some mountains in it originally, But for Direfell, I knew that I wanted it to be more uneven terrain. I did have the mountains originally intended for a good portion of it, but I didn't really care if it was actual mountains or if it was just uneven terrain, if it was just more kind of rockish or more, a bunch of hills and this and that. I just wanted it to be, a lot of uneven terrain as a whole. And I felt like, as I was actually making this, that a lot of the terrain that I had picked out for like the forest or whatever had uneven terrain in it, and I was like, that's what I want, and I just let it naturally adapt to how the actual map itself was being built and the terrain as a whole being comprised of. And here you can tell if the two images aren't completely lining up how you want it. You can't just kind of erase part of it because it doesn't quite reach there. I try to get whatever angle that I need. I try to find a small portion of that and just kind of copy and paste it, and then kind of fit that there to kind of blend in a little bit. Not really blend in, but kind of use that little edge there to make it look like it should be connecting like that or whatever. And now you can see I'm kind of starting to blend in a little bit. I just take the erase tool and use a different type of brush. I don't use the regular solid brush like what I was using or what I'm using now to kind of erase some of the edges or whatever. I kind of go in something that's got a randomized pattern and maybe even have like a fade, so it might partially erase it but not much. That way it looks kind of more naturally blended instead of having all these hard edges, especially if you do have that fade in it. But you don't want to use just the round one with the fade going off. You want the bunch of different patterns and textures or whatever. So you want it kind of speckled in a sense. And there are plenty of different erasers. I use one that's called Sponge. I use some that's called Splatters. I think there's some that's called Plantation or Vegetation or something. So that's what I usually try to do. I do some kind of fade like what you're seeing now around some of the edges, but most of the time it is a sponge or something like that. What I'm doing now is I'm adding the water for the background, since I will eventually go through and erase all the water around it so it's all the same color. And then I am taking some of the environment that is, the larger portions of the environment without many coastlines, and I'm just taking some of them. At times, depending on the type of terrain, I might go through and actually use different images. On this one, I just kind of use the same one over and over, kind of rotate it and kind of blend it slightly so there's no hard edges, but just looking at it you can tell it's a repetitiveness. And basically what this is going to work as is just the backdrop of the actual map itself once you get done, because there might be portions where some of the images that you did create don't quite blend in properly, or it might have blended in too much. You might erase a little too much, so you have a little bit of that blue showing through where you don't want water. So this is kind of covers that up. So what you see bleeding through is that, and those spots should be small enough that you're not really seeing the actual image. You're just kind of getting a little bit of the color and maybe some of the texture or terrain or whatever, but not much of it. And I usually do that for each of the environments. This one I did one for kind of like the uneven terrain for the forest or whatever with the trees, and then I did it for the mountain area, which I actually don't even end up using any of the mountain, but I created it because I wasn't sure at that point. And right now you can see me going in, like I mentioned, and erasing all of the water that was around the map. And I had actually saved the image of all of it as one image, so I could just select it as a whole and collect all that water and erase it. And then I will go back later and erase it from each individual. I know that kind of sounds, backwards or, waste of time, but for me, I find it just be easier that way. But yeah. And with the portions of that map that I was talking about with the background to, in case it bleeds through, I usually duplicate that as well, put one on the very bottom of the layers, or just above the water. That way, I bleach through that instead of the water. But also keep one at the very top, so later if I need to do a little bit additional blending than what I was able to do, I can blend that into the different terrains so it looks more naturally blended. Especially like with the forest and the mountains on here. If I had it and I wanted more trees in the mountains, I could kind of lay that over on top of it and kind of blend it into the forest, which wouldn't really show up much, but maybe a little bit, and then blend it onto the mountain area as well. And that way it kind of gradually pulls into both of the terrains and not just one of them. And then as I was talking, you could see me actually going through and deleting all that water from each individual layer like I was talking about. And now I am going back with the different images that I had already lined up with the coastline or whatever, so it's already perfectly lined up, and I am starting to blend them in with the eraser, with the brush like Galaxy or the sponge or something like that. And I try to switch those up every so often. I'll use the same brush tool for a couple of them, and then I'll kind of switch it up just because I want to. It just feels more natural that way. It's not something that you're really going to see, especially on a map this large of scale, because it's going to be so small of a blend. But if you are doing something that's, closer zoomed in or whatever, the blending might be a little noticeable, so you want different type of brushes so it doesn't all look like the same. It gives it more of an organic type feel.
We're on a trip, but we didn't feel that shit. Pouring acid into your minds and we ride our legs. Our time is coming, just listen for the tick, tick. Boom. You think I'm throwing darts just cause I'm hitting bullseyes? Still I'm blind when I rhyme with my mind on pause. I'm about to drop like a New Year's Eve ball. You can't fuck with me, y'all. Cause I keep flowing like the Niagara Falls. Dropping palms when I'm amputating you. Dropping bombs into your cranium. Blow your face.
And at this point, when I'm actually kind of blending in the terrain, is when I'm really kind of determining exactly how I want it to look. So I'll know how much to erase, or how much, of the top layer that I'm working on to show, or the bottom layer that's below it to show. And another trick I had learned with the whole fade and trying to blend it, if you try to blend around actual breaks in the environment itself instead of just trying to blend the edges, it tends to blend better. So if you follow like a natural terrain type ordeal, like either the mountain ridge, like right along the coast of it or the side of it or whatever, like I'm kind of doing here, or if you go and blend like by a river or something, it makes it look more natural and more realistic that way. That way, it's got a slight difference to the base of it maybe, but it still looks pretty realistic, because a lot of times around those changes in the texture of the environment, whether it be a river, mountains, or whatever, the terrain typically does have a little bit different of a look to it, whether it is a lighter tone or a darker tone or whatever. It just happens that way.
The shit that you biting, the shit is all gone. Never asked for any help, I went and got on my own. Came up from the bottom, from the parts of the unknown. A boot hill representing, yeah, that's my home. I'm with my little homie, so I'm not alone. If you're looking for us, you can find us in our zone. Got a zone in my pocket, I'm stoned. I'm going like a rocket, smoking, rolling out my dome, even out my eye sockets. Every verse we own, King James in the modern prophet. When I get my zone, you can find me levitating.
And also, while I am doing all these blendings and stuff, there are certain areas where I know that's another layer is going to overlap it. So it might seem kind of like pointless to try to blend all the way around all the edges that's already on top of something. but I find it easier to go ahead and just erase and blend the entire form of the image or the layer or whatever, to blend it in with whatever's beneath it, so whenever you do overlay something else on top of it, even though you won't be able to see that blend, if you happen to blend it too much, or it might not reach exactly how far you thought it would, you're still not getting that hard edge because whatever's beneath it is already blended, and that will save you from having to jump back and forth between layers to go, oh, well, I need to blend this a little bit more or do whatever. It's already there, it's already blended, so you don't have to jump back to it.
One up for life. You know my one up for shit. Go ask my wife. I'm like, fuck die, never give up without a fight. I'm always like trying new shit. That's with the way that I write. Hit after hit, making tunes that you like. But yeah, you guessed it. Fuck it, I'm white. And yeah, I have to fit the stereotype. And it happened more than once, happened twice. And you know it's all because of punk ass vanilla ice. If I ever meet him, gonna beat him with a knife. Yeah, that game ain't nice, so if you like, neither am I. You gonna eat the whole cake, but break it off a slice. Every day I roll the dice, go hard 24/7, 365. Gotta sacrifice time, it all comes with a price. If you're scared, go to church and pray to Christ. Maybe you'll see the light. And shout out to the white rappers, never give up, you have to do what you like.
First show was for a bunch of kids, standing on the front porch, pumping the fist. One of them thought he was a whiz, said he could spit way much better than this. So we cut him out, told him to shred his guitar to bitch. We took the mic, stood there, don't sweat up with the knees. All his friends started to joke, making fun of him cause he had jokes. The next morning in the ashtray, found his brother's ropes. He lit it, took in his first breath of smoke, cocked a couple of times.
And as you can start to tell, or you probably could tell earlier, I decided to start making a lot more of the rougher terrain where instead of having it as much of plains land as I had in my incarnate version, even down here on the far end. It's just something I decided to go with, and that's why I didn't focus too much on trying to make the mountain area as much mountains, because I didn't really care if it was mountains. I knew I wanted some there or whatever. But I just knew I wanted it to be a more of a rougher terrain. And then here you can kind of see where I was talking about the outlining of the terrain itself. As you erase it, kind of follow along that.
So now that I said my dead angel, you know it's the truth. I fell from heaven's grace down to the same level as you, and not further down into the ground. I'm digging myself back out now, cause I'm not okay with my past, but I had to face facts. What I did was wrong and I even knew that. I kept it covered up and hidden with my mouth quiet, even though my wallet thick and I had to keep my business private. But here lately I'm digging up full skeletons, stuff with the other bag now, and I'm never doing it again. You see, I'm not okay living that way. I was right out of school, I just wanted my own place. Kicked it with some friends, dreaming of being the man. On top of the totem pole, the guardian of the fan.
And a lot of times for rivers, I try to use natural rivers and try to blend them together. So it looks like one river blends into another one. So that way the actual river bends and stuff look more natural. I don't always do that, but I do try to do that a lot. I know for METAGORE, with all the rivers that's in it, I did use real rivers, and then I kind of try to use some other stuff that wasn't really rivers, but it kind of looked like rivers, and kind of followed that as well. On here, I did not do that. I started it off with a little bit of a river up at the top, and then I just took regular coastlines and made it. And then the river itself that I create is a lot wider than what a normal river would be, but I am perfectly fine with that. I don't care how much it looks realistically or anything like that. It's a fantasy world, that's what I want. But yeah, also something talk about realisticness. Rivers in nature do not diverge from each other. They converge, but they don't diverge. So you will never see a river split in two. You will see two rivers come together, but not the opposite. Just because water finds its lowest point, and that's the way it travels. So for a river to split into two, it would have to have two low points, and it wouldn't do that naturally. The only time that you see things similar to that is more around deltas, where the land kind of flattens out more, and you know, it just kind of spills out in all directions because it's all pretty much the same. But actual low level for it to be a river or anything, it's not going to happen, not naturally. Which in Direfell, as you can tell, I do have that. And it's not naturally, if you go into the history and stuff, which hasn't been posted anywhere or anything like that, but just in the history that I know, and it might get brought up in a story somewhere at some point in time, I don't know. But the river that's going to the left of the screen, that is called altered waters, and it's because it's man-made. They altered the course of the water. And I had actually thought about making it a dam up at the top of that water wherever it actually meets the other portion of the river. And they would open it every so often for it to fill that up, as well as it would be kind of naturally filled up with the ocean water, but not actually a river flowing into it, if that makes sense. Right now, what I was doing was going through and merging all the layers, so they're all on the same, and then I'm just kind of doing a little bit of the overlay blend I wanted to do, that I had mentioned earlier with the waters and stuff.
Next time you see me, I'll be in a better state of mind. And I know this happiness, it isn't hard to find. I called him my nephew Stu, and he was like, yo homie, what to do? It's time to get started on Mid-South Blues Part 2.
Now I'm just kind of tweaking that little, I guess you could call it an island, that portion of land between those two rivers or whatever. And yeah, that's it. I hope y'all enjoyed it.
Nights like tonight, I feel right at home, staring at the fog, wandering to the unknown. Close my eyes, and I let my mind roam. I let it take me as far as it wants to take me. Nights like tonight, I feel right at home, staring at the fog, wandering to the unknown. Close my eyes, and I let my mind roam, and let it take me as far as it wants to take me.